Welcome to Robert Bellissimo at the Movies, where we explore all things cinema. I want to welcome to the show John Bleasdale, who is a film critic and writer whose work is regularly published in Variety, Sight and Sound, The Economist, Financial Times, and The Guardian. He has contributed to two books, Terrence Malick, Film and Philosophy, and The Way of Nature and the Way of Grace, Philosophical Footholds on Terrence Malick's The Tree of Life. He also hosts the podcast Writers on Film, which was featured in Time Out's top 20 best podcasts. And today we're discussing one of his latest book, The Magic Hours: The Films and Hidden Life of Terrence Malick. John, welcome. Thanks again for being here.
Thank you, Robert. It's a pleasure to be here.
Right off the top, I just wanted to say how much I enjoyed this book. I mean, you really got me to love Malick, I must say, because I hadn't seen. I took the opportunity while reading the book to watch all of his movies back to back. And it occurred to me that I had only seen Badlands, Tree of Life, To the Wonder, and I don't think I'd seen no, I hadn't seen the other ones. And so oh no, Thin Red Line I saw. I'd seen that, but many years ago. And you know, because his films are hard to watch in a lot of ways. And so the book I just felt was just a wonderful companion to getting a deeper appreciation of Malick and also just how to watch these movies because you can't watch them, as you know, like you watch most, a more conventional film. But I thought his life was fascinating, and I just thought you did a great job. So I really enjoyed it.
Oh, thanks so much, Robert. I really appreciate it. And that also that idea that it's inspired you, and hopefully it will others to sort of go and watch or rewatch
Yeah,
Malik, is exactly, it's exactly the aim of the book. That's what I want people to do to sort of help. I hope they don't need too much help, but
right.
help them to see have a richer appreciation of his work.
For sure. Yeah, that's the experience I had. But I was listening to some other interviews with that you've done recently. I understand that the part of the reason why you chose to write a book on Malik was because he's been so mysterious and he hasn't talked to a journalist in many years. Can you talk a little bit about why Malik was your choice for your first film book, that is?
Yeah, I mean, I really didn't intend to write a film book. I mean, I have this podcast, Writers on Film, that you mentioned earlier, which is dedicated to people coming on and talking about film books because I love reading them. But it's one of those things that I love reading lots of books that I have no intention of writing. And I write about film, but I always think there's a big difference between film journalism, reviews, and a film book. Um, I was interviewing Pat McGilligan for an interview way back when. This is before the Woody Allen biography that I've recently interviewed him for. We were talking about James Cagney and Clint Eastwood and other people that he'd interviewed, that he'd written biographies of. And at the end of the interview, he said, "Look, why aren't you writing a film book?" And I said, I said, well, I hadn't really considered it. And he said, well, you should pitch it to us because we're doing a series of film. You can go back and listen to the episode. I think it's right at the end of the episode, him sort of saying,
Oh,
and he sort of said, well, who would you do? And I said, Terrence Malick, without a moment's hesitation. And he said, well, why that? And I said, well, he's a limited number of films. So you're not doing like Michael Curtiz and looking at a filmography of something like 70, 80 films, or Alfred Hitchcock, or Clint Eastwood for that matter, who has massive filmographies.
mm,
So you're not doing that. His life has genuine mystery to it. There are unasked questions, and because of those unasked questions, the treatment of Malik in writing has been very one-sided. It's picked on philosophy as its and filmosophy, the idea that you can look at film as a way of thinking about big ideas and thinking about big philosophical questions. It's picked on that primarily because he went to Harvard and he did a degree, and he then did some postgraduate work in philosophy. And I don't think that's. I think his biography shows that there's actually much more to him than that, and that's a sort of one-sided way of looking at him. And so the biographical route was very interesting in that way, both revealing, but also it just didn't feel that it had been done before. So those were the real reasons I did it. And Pat incredibly generously, and don't. I hope this doesn't, inspire too many people to run to Pat and say, give me the, because I'm sure he wouldn't thank me for it. I think it was a little bit of a favor, but he basically said, okay, let's. He sent me some pitch documents that had been successful previously, and so I read through it and I sort of learned how to write a pitch, and I pitched it to the publisher, and they said yeah, and then you have that nightmare of going, oh no, I've now got to actually write this book. And I mean, I've written a PhD thesis before, which is a similar length, 100,000, words. So I knew I could do that, and I've written novels before, so I know I can write something which is just basically a book length. But I also know that this is going to be a year, 2 years of my life that I'm going to be, you know, suddenly I'm going to have to turn over to this project. So weirdly, it was that sort of, there was a moment where I thought, do I really want to do this? Is this really what you know, uh, and I'm glad I did, because it ultimately was an incredibly happy experience, and it was very fulfilling, and it's worked out well, and the book has been very warmly received. I'm very grateful for that. But it's a gamble. You know?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, and here, and like I said, here's someone who hasn't talked to journalists in quite some time. He doesn't do Q&As. There's not even a lot of. I remember when I was in my late teens, a friend of mine said, "Oh, Malick, you can't even find a picture of him from the last 20, 30 years or something." And I remember finding that very intriguing at the time. So, and I know you tried to reach out to him. Of course, naturally, he wasn't going to give you an interview. But could you talk a little bit about was it challenging to, discover who he was as a result of him being so mysterious? Like, how did you gain the trust of others who knew him to open up to you?
I think there was a couple of things. I emailed his people, so I found who his people were, and I mean, it's a funny thing when you start writing a book of this sort. I realized you have to invest in it. You have to invest a certain amount of money, and that's probably going to be your advance, because your advance is not that much. And
Right.
what you invest in is, like, you get IMDb Pro, you get some sort of there was like a newspapers.com, so that you can go back and you can find newspapers from archives.org or whatever. I don't want to advertise these places, but an archive site, a newspaper site, uh, places that you can go to and you can find out information. You can find out email addresses, how to contact people, and all that sort of stuff. So IMDb Pro, for instance, is essential for that
Yeah.
kind of
Oh, for
to
sure.
to get you that information. And then you just start writing to people and you start saying, okay, this is my project, and you start approaching them. And often the reply you get straight away will be, who else are you talking to?
Mm.
So at the very beginning, it's kind of difficult to crack that thing, because they want to know, are you serious? Who are you writing it for? What type of book are you writing? What's your approach? And there's a kind of a feeling out that is taking place. And you're right, his people came back and said, Mr. Malick is very aware of what you're doing, and he is very grateful for the time and consideration you are giving to his work, but he has considered it a policy for many years now to separate his private life from his public role as a
Right.
filmmaker, and so he regretfully declines. And I was kind of insistent, which is another thing that you have to learn, and was I and continued to say things, send more emails saying, okay, well, what about fact checking? What about if I just give you some, and I didn't make a huge amount of progress, but I think what happened was sort of word got out that it was going to be okay to talk to this guy. So when I went to people like his editor, Billy Weber, his production designer, Jack Fisk, um, there was a real sense that these guys wanted to talk to me. George Stevens Jr., who knew he was the founder of AFI and interviewed Malick for the job for the post in the conservatory in the AFI Film School. They were really willing to talk to me. And I mean, old school friends, lots and lots of different people. And they were really, really willing to talk to me. And I got the feeling that that came from uh, that somewhere along the lines, Terry himself or somebody had said, yeah, this guy's okay. You can talk to him. He's not writing a gotcha book, or he's
Right.
not writing a. And I did get the feeling that there was a book by Peter Biskind called Easy Riders, Raging Bulls, a
Right.
few published a couple of decades ago now. It's
Right.
very popular. There's a documentary made about it as well. But this book has a very distinct thesis, which is the new Hollywood turn up and they're very talented young guys and they're taking over the studios, they're taking on the studios, and they make some of the best cinema in the world, and then it goes to hell in a handbasket because they're all off their faces on drugs and excess and pretentiousness and all the rest of it. And this thesis sort of run, and it's all anecdotal and it's very, I think it's very entertaining. It's very well written. It's a wonderful book in many ways, but it does draw a pretty garish sort of
Yeah.
portrait. And I got the feeling there were some bits in that book about Malick that weren't appreciated. And so I think there was a sense as well that there needed to be a corrective, that there was a view of Malick that had been put into the world, which was this otherworldly, remote, reclusive genius who was almost, if you read some interviews or if you read Biskind's, he did a big piece for Vanity Fair as well called "The Runaway Genius." Um, that he was kind of, borderline crazy. That he was, wearing shoes for hats, and I mean that's a silly example because that's not in the article, but that he was walking around America listening to birds and stuff.
Right.
And interestingly, I kind of contacted Peter Biskind to interview him for the book, and he didn't want to at all. And that was kind of slightly telling in itself that he didn't want to be challenged on any of this. I felt. I might be wrong. He might have just been busy and thought, "Who's this twerp?" But yeah. So it's a long answer. Sorry, you've
No,
got
no,
to
no.
stop. Got to stop me from babbling. But um, the initial point I guess I was trying to make was that these people. I mean, Jack Fisk said to me, "I want people to know what a great guy Terry is,
Yeah.
and I want people." And James Newton Howard, who I talked to, said, "I can't talk about Terry without smiling,
Yeah.
because
Like,
he just that gladdens my heart." And I got that again and again and again from different people. And some people, they would be tearing their hair out in working with Terry, and they would be very honest about how difficult it was to work with his technique and his system and his way of doing things. But there was and one last thing that emerges immediately is he's not a recluse.
right.
He is talking to everybody.
Yeah.
He's just telling everybody, please don't say that I'm talking to you. please don't go public with any of this. Keep our conversations private. So in that sense, it was very easy to write. It was much easier to write the book because as long as those rules were being obeyed by his friends and his family and all the rest of it, as long as there was that sort of, then they were willing to talk to me.
Hmm.
And we have a thing in journalism called on background, where I'm sure your listeners and viewers will know about this, but if they don't, it just simply means if somebody doesn't want to be quoted, you can talk to them, you can use that information, but you don't use their name
I
and
see.
you don't cite. So there was quite there's a note at the beginning of the book where I make that point
Yeah,
of, you know, if the book it will suffer a little bit academically because it won't have the extensive footnotes that academic books often have. Um, but the decision was, do I do that, or do I do footnotes, or do I go the journalist route in which I tell a really good story, and you just have to trust me. I've spoken to those people who know about it.
and the fact that word got around that you would be okay to talk to, I mean, what do you think it was about you that made people feel that?
Um, my kind eyes and I don't know. I'm not entirely sure of that. I think that after the first couple of interviews, there was a sense of like, oh, he's on our side.
Right.
He has a genuine love of the movies.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, I've published reviews of many Malick films prior to doing this, and there is one very bad review, which I think I quote in the book for Voyage of Time. I think it was like one
Yeah.
star or 2 stars. A film like some of his films I've changed my mind about because now I'm seeing a larger context. So I mean, I think aside with that one exception, I think there was a sense that this was someone who was appreciating
Hmm.
the films, and also it helps that I'm writing for Sight and Sound,
Right.
maybe rather than, I don't know, a publication which is a little I don't know, scurrilous or something, or searching
Right.
for, if I'm I don't know what it would be, the Enquirer, or some other having some other manifesto, or not manifesto, sorry, agenda is the word
Right.
I'm looking for.
I see. And you write about he wasn't someone who was a cinephile, but he loved movies. He loved, and you talk about, he loved the French New Wave, he loved Antonioni, he loved Godard. Do you see that? Do you see those filmmakers or the French, those styles in? I mean, his film does no his films don't look like anybody else's, but there is, I mean, at least for me, once I read that, I'm like, oh, you start to see in his work those influences. I mean, do you see that directly in his work, from Godard and Truffaut and Antonioni, people like that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just to take the first thing you said about he wasn't particularly a cinephile, I'll just take that for 1 second and come
Sure.
back to the European influences. I think the thing was at this school that he was at, St. Stephen's, he got really into literature. He was into science. He was into sport in a big way, and he was in book clubs. He was in theatrical productions, and then when he went to Harvard and then Oxford, and then he was traveling and whatnot, there was a real sense that he was kind of like a Renaissance man. He was picking up all these skills from different places, and yet at the same time was being a bit of a jack of all trades, not quite settling on any one. My problem with the academia view of him, or the view of him as a philosopher king, is like he didn't do any philosophy from you know when he finished a very brief sort of MIT. He was essentially a supply teacher.
Right.
People would say, "Oh, he taught philosophy at MIT." He didn't. He covered for someone during a semester, and he didn't feel he was successful. He might have done a few like odd odd seminars here and there over the years subsequently, but it was not like he was not rigorously following up as a philosopher. So that isn't, he was as much a journalist as he was a philosopher.
Mm.
He did as much work as a journalist. So he was doing all that sort of stuff, and so I feel very much he was picking up influences, for instance, from reading a lot.
Wow.
There's a lot of books and poetry in his work. He's very influenced by literature. So, there's writers like Walker Percy, who are not particularly well known, or writers like, Dostoevsky's a really huge influence. Thoreau and Emerson, all that, those guys are obviously there in his movies, and he's someone he feels like he's someone who really goes into books and into, really, he's someone who'll give people books, you know. So I mean, a number of people have received The Moviegoer by Walker Percy from him
Mm.
as like, you have to read this, it will change your life. So the influence of books on him, I think, has to be acknowledged. He's really a keen, avid reader. He meets Martin Sheen in Paris, and he sort of drags him into a bookshop and starts pulling books off the shelves. You've got to read this and this and this and this until Sheen has a whole pile of them. And many of his actors, he will give novels to read. Like Olga Kurylenko got like Anna Karenina and I think of Dostoevsky, and it was like, these, you have to read these two, and her character is a composite of three different sort of Russian heroines. And then to go back to the new wave and the European and the cinema, yes, he was watching. I think he had this thing of a cinephilism, which wasn't as programmatic. I mean, I think this is slightly to do with him coming out of Texas. Is he wasn't like in a city where there was a massive repertory theatre scene where he could go and see loads of seasons and be involved in festivals and things like that and be surrounded by people who knew a lot. I think he was really picking it up as he went along, and he was impressed by things, but he almost didn't know what he was supposed to be impressed by. So there was a great freedom for him to form his own taste.
I see.
Um, Last year's at Marienbad, for instance, last year at Marienbad was a particular influence that he cites, and that was uh, and there were many others. And I think, especially when you see those later films from To the Wonder, that trilogy, To the Wonder, Night of Cups and Song to Song, there's a real sense that they're almost better looked at as European art films than
Yeah.
they are as sort of American movies, because they're much closer to that tradition than they are any sort of American movie making tradition.
Yeah.
Um, and it has to be said as well, Bonnie and Clyde is a huge influence on Badlands, and Bonnie and Clyde was originally written for, Francois Truffaut to film, and Jean-Luc Godard was going to film it as well,
Right.
came over and had interviews with the scriptwriters. So, that the new wave of Hollywood is highly influenced by the Nouvelle Vague of France.
Yes.
So in that sense, he is also of his time. But and I'll shut up. Last point was when he was in the AFI, they would have directors come in from like classical Hollywood, like John Ford and Harold Lloyd, and people would just come in and give lectures and just sit down and say, "What do you want to know?" And it could be practical advice, it could be philosophizing, it could be, how did you get that shot in that film?
Right.
What was how do you talk to actors? It's incredibly rich, and he's in the first year, so nobody really knows. I mean, I teach at university. In the first year of any university course or any nobody knows what they're doing. So the first year is like, let's find out how to teach the second year, and let's find out how to teach the third year, because nobody knows how to teach the first year. And while he was there, John Cassavetes was
Right.
like the filmmaker in residence. He's actually there, like has an office across the hall, and a year later, Lynch turns up and starts making Eraserhead in the stables. This is an incredible moment of creative crossover, both internationally, as you say, with people like Antonioni coming over to America to make Zabriskie Point, and London to make Blow Up, and and sort of nationally, vertically, in terms of time, in terms of you know, you're in the 60s and early 70s, and you have John Ford sitting there telling you, how he made Red River.
Right. Yes. I'm fascinated also by the if you look at the cinematography in his movies, and they're so beautiful, and poetic and painterly, even if the material is quite grim, like in the case of Badlands. Yet, you write about that, the famous shot with Sheen with the moon in the background, and he's got the gun on his back. It's you can't I can't help but wonder, what why does he making such grim material, all not shying away from the brutality, but also having, looking at it in such a poetic fashion, and time again, up until even A Hidden Life, his last film, he's doing that. And is that, do you think that's because he always saw the good, even, as cliche as it may sound, the good in the bad, and the bad the bad in the good, sort of like Renoir in that sense? Like he always sees the good side of things, and so he's sort of layering it that way. That's how I saw it. Is that sort of how you see that as well?
I think he always saw that people lived in the world, and um, what they do in the world is not necessarily connected to the world itself. Um, so you can be a murderer and still look at a beautiful landscape and be a part of that beautiful landscape. It's maybe open to question whether you appreciate that beautiful landscape or not. You could say Martin Sheen maybe is thinking, I look a lot like James Dean in Giant while I do this pose.
Right, right,
That could be what's good. He could be replaying that movie in his head. And Giant's a beautiful movie, so why not?
right.
Filmed by George Stevens. George Stevens Jr.'s
Yes,
father.
yes,
And everything is intertwined and mixed. Um, I mean, a really good example of that, actually. I mean, it runs throughout his film so much that is a theme, that characters are often doing something which locally, individually, personally is hard or difficult or violent or brutal, and they're doing it in a world which is gorgeous
right,
and wonderfully rendered. So, Days of Heaven, the itinerant workers are living lives close to the level of starvation, certainly lives which are narrow. You might think, oh, those fields are beautiful, but for them, those fields are where they're working. They're the factory floor.
right.
And for the animals, the arrival of the machinery is death, is going to kill them. And the fire might look wonderful, but it's also an exhilarating, but it's also going to
Mm,
destroy everything.
right,
Thin Red Line is a paradise and is going to be torn to pieces by the actions of the people.
right,
Um, so there is an interaction in that sense as well. Hidden Life, that I mean, Hidden Life really interrogates that notion because it's saying, we thought we could live above the clouds,
right.
literally, aloof from history. And then when you see the footage of the archive material, it comes as a real shock that, a man is warming his child's feet by the fire, and there's such pain and suffering in that film
Mm,
that yeah, is it morally acceptable to live an okay life while so much suffering is happening? Can you live above the clouds when the world is going to pieces? I mean, we see this every day now.
right.
I don't even have to name names. You know exactly what I'm talking about.
Absolutely.
in terms of what's going on in the world and around the world in more than one place. Um, so I think he's really interrogating that. I don't think it's the case that he's just going, "Oh, pretty picture."
Right, of
You know,
course.
I'll put this. I think he knows that Richard Gere and Brooke Adams are have because otherwise the choice that they have to make would just be banal. It would just be, oh, we'll just cheat this guy out of some money and we'll be
Mhm.
on our way. And that's not, he takes it seriously. They're not making a banal choice. They're making a choice about survival ultimately. You know, he's got more money than he knows what to do with. We're poor. He's going to be dead in 6 months, and so it won't hurt him. He doesn't need to know that he's ever been tricked. So they're trying to frame an immoral action in as moral a way as possible.
Yeah.
Um, and it doesn't work out, and that's the tragedy. I mean, as someone once said, tragedy is when everybody's making the right decision or everybody thinks they're right, they're making, but of course they can't be, they're all clashing, you know.
Right.
Um, and Days of Heaven certainly is that. Everybody has a good reason to do what they do and think what they think. It's just, you know, unfortunately, it leads to where it leads to.
Hmm. And just as a for just to give people a bit of a sample of the book, I mean, because I know there's a number of reasons for it, but he makes speaking of Days of Heaven, he makes Days of Heaven 78, and then he doesn't make another film for another 20 years, Thin Red Line. Um, which is like it's like unheard of that. I mean, I can't think of another director that has that and that big of a gap. And then we go into the later period where it's like almost a film every year or every other year after Tree of Life. Can you just tell us without spoiling too much of the book, just give us a couple of reasons as to why this happened this way for him?
Um, I think there was always I think so, in some sense there's a sort of clue in the run up to the big gap. Um, and that was in how he was finding his way in the world. He'd already tried to be an academic, it hadn't quite worked out. Um, and then he tried to be a journalist. No surprise, he couldn't make deadlines work, so he ended up. And by the way, all of these things is very noticeable that he starts at the top. He never starts sort of like writing for the local newspaper. He starts writing for the New Yorker, and he starts in Harvard. He doesn't start in some, community college and then work his way up to some. He starts teaching in MIT.
Right.
So that's always interesting that he lives. He does live above the clouds in that sense. He's always at the top of whatever he's doing. So then when he makes Badlands, and then there's a pretty big gap, during which time his first marriage begins to fail, and by the time he makes a second film, Days of Heaven, he's on his own, and he's concentrating on making the film. And when he finishes that film, the owner of the studio's parent company, so it's not even the owner of the studio, it's the owner of the parent company, loves it and says, we want to make films with you. We'll make anything you like, and we'll give you a blank check, give you money, can have offices on the lot, and you can start your team working on your next project. And the sort of rationale behind this, and it seems very strange these days in our sort of in the current economic climate, art in this economy. Um, their idea was, well, we make money on a lot of things. It'd be nice to have some prestige projects that we're never going to make any money on, but they're going to look good. So Days of Heaven wasn't a huge commercial hit, but made back its budget. It was fine, but it wasn't making a ton of money. But it was like, yeah, but it won a big award at Cannes, won an Oscar, was nominated for a few Oscars. It got received well, and it looks beautiful. And this is the kind of filmmaker we want inside our stable, and he will Maybe he'll make us a hits one day, but it really doesn't matter. All we want to do is be associated with this kind of art, and we'll make money with Grease and with other films along the way. And I think that there's a problem though. Once you give someone a blank check and say you can make whatever you want, then the next minute is like, oh, the twin of anything is nothing at all.
Right.
So he ends up going with his girlfriend to Paris, who is a sort of filmmaker in her own right, and a production. She was working with him as a production assistant on Days of Heaven, and he ends up sort of living in Paris a little bit. He commutes for a little while, and he just, time begins to tick on, and he's writing scripts, and he's thinking about what to do next, and he's going for one thing, and at a certain point, he realizes this big project that he wanted to do, which is kind of called Q, and some people dispute this, and there's a Spanish word which is used. Uh, it's in the book. I can't recall it exactly now, but which is Q stands for this apparently. And the idea is it's essentially the history of the universe from the beginning to some story that's going to happen in the middle, and then you're going to see the end of the universe at the end. Which anybody who's seen Tree of Life will sound very familiar. But he got to a certain point where he just thought, I can't, I'm undecided about what story I want to tell in the middle. I've got the big grandiose bits, but there was an idea of doing a story about his family in Persia, now Iran. And there was ideas about he had an idea about doing a story about Pocahontas and John Smith that was still there was one about Eleanor Roosevelt. There was a whole bunch of scripts, and it just nothing quite worked out. And I think he just ended up and look, I enjoy living in Paris and doing my own thing, and I've got a bit of money, and there's no economic necessity for me to work right away. And the years just began to tick by, and nothing came out. And he would regularly meet and talk with people from Hollywood. Mike Medavoy, who all through the 80s had a career of like founding and running Orion, and then he basically studio head at various points in his career, huge player and producer, would often sort of drop a script in his lap and say, can you do anything with this, or can we get something off the ground? So it was not as if he was like, if at any point he turned around and said, I've got a script and I really want to make this movie, I think it would have gone. I think he would have been able to do it. But he he didn't. I don't think he really wanted to make a movie that much. In the 90s, a pair of producers had contacted him in the 80s actually with an idea of making various projects, which are all detailed in the book.
Yeah.
Um, and they were the ones who that's when Thin Red Line began to come up as a potential project. There was like Sancho the Bailiff,
Yeah.
an original script called the English Speaker, and Thin Red Line. Those were the projects which looked like they were going to happen. But these producers were on the fringes of Hollywood, to say the least. And they didn't have a great track record. They didn't have a huge number of credits to their name. And the one credit they did have was with Robert Altman, and he had apparently banned them from the projection room and
Right.
wouldn't the screening room. And so there was a sense that they were very big on promising stuff and not necessarily delivering, but they did shovel kind of a lot of money his way, and for rights and for and the project that increasingly came forward was Thin Red Line, but that took some years before it finally got to the stage of this is going to actually seriously become a film. That was only when Mike Medavoy sort of stepped in and said, "Okay, if this is what you want to make, let's do it." And that was a point where it began to become a reality.
Right. And I'm fascinated that we have 20 years between Days of Heaven and Thin Red Line, and then then we have New World, we have Tree of Life, and then before you know it, every other year we're seeing a new Malick film. And I understand, again, not to give too much away, but it's this, he found people that he just really loved to work with, where that really wasn't the case in the early days, because he that was more of a struggle. I mean, do you think that's a big part of why he was more creatively inspired in the last decade or so?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he loved filming stuff on his own, right?
Right.
His father was a photographer, and that's one of the people who taught him a lot about how to develop film, what sort of film to use, what sort of lenses. So he was very much into that sort of technical side of it. And he would talk about like, you know, he would know the technical aspects of the screens in certain cinemas in France and things like that. A little bit of Kubrick in him in that sense. Um, when he um, w- when he'd made, I mean, it's funny. Just go back for a second to your sort of like that 20-year gap. There is a director who has had that 20-year gap, but he did go into producing during that gap, and that's George Lucas. He
Oh, right, right.
between sort of A New Hope and Phantom Menace, there's a
Sure.
long gap, but then he was producing, so he was very
Yeah.
visibly in creatively a creative producer as well. Um, so it's not really comparable, but it is one name that I always think of when I think of that gap. Um, but when but sorry, when he was doing Badlands and when he was doing Badlands, everyone thought he was crazy, and he was ignorant. He didn't know some very basic terminology. He didn't know that the toilets were called the honey wagon. He thought the honey wagon was the catering. So that's a very big mistake to make. You don't want to send people to the honey wagon for lunch, or order a bunch of honey wagons when everybody's waiting to eat. Um, and he would do things which you can see for a conventional film crew were really controversial. So, he would film a scene and keep getting them to move everything and film the reaction shots and then back to the original person who's speaking and move everything again. So, well, no, why don't we just shoot everything in this direction and then do the reverse shot? I don't know. And they would set up a shot and he'd want to shoot over there. And so they'd have to move things and then he'd change his mind and move back. So there were things that would drive people crazy. And he wanted to have this very specific light, which was natural light. It was and for a cameraman, I mean, I talked to two cinematographers 2 weeks ago, Frederick Elms and Peter Deming, who were the cinematographers who were responsible for David Lynch's about 50% of David Lynch's cinematic
Hmm.
output is either one of these cinematographers, or Freddie Francis is the guy who picked up the rest of it mostly. And they were saying, I wanted to serve David Lynch
Right.
and his vision, but I also wanted to get my next job. So if David Lynch is saying, make it darker, I want it to be darker, part of you is still saying, yeah, but when my colleagues and when other directors see this, they're going to think an idiot filmed it. They're going to think, this cameraman doesn't know how to use a light meter. And so that's what, especially on Badlands, people were thinking, I'm not letting this first time filmmaker ruin my reputation. And so they would say, I'm going to hold the clapperboard upside down to register my protest, which is a convention. And yet it can't be good for your confidence to see that this older crew that has much more experience than you is basically rebelling. And Badlands was a non-union crew
Right.
as well, so you're making a lot of compromises just to keep the budget down.
Hmm.
Days of Heaven, he'd already got in Nestor Armandaros, a cinematographer who was very, very sympathetic with what he was trying to do. And he was like, yes, natural light, perfect.
Yeah.
Magic hour, perfect. And he writes glowingly of his experience doing Days of Heaven. And then when he won the Oscar, he said, "This is for Terrence Malick because you are behind all these shots. It's not me, it's you." Um, when he gets to Thin Red Line, I think he had a surprisingly good time on. He brings it in under budget or on the budget on the right time, and he's really proving I can be a Hollywood director, and he really is. I mean, geez, he steps up from, what Days of Heaven, what's three lead characters in that film, to a massive film with massive extras and massive, what in Days of Heaven you have one, two set pieces maybe. Thin Red Line you have, eight, nine set pieces.
Yeah.
So he achieves what he wants to achieve. When he gets to the New World, he comes with Chivo, who is the cinematographer Emmanuel Lubetsky, Chivo by nickname, nom de art. Um, and again, he clicks with this guy, and he's like, if Terry wants to do it one way, Chivo wants to do it that way times 100. He's
Mhm.
well into. You want to push it, you want to experiment, so do I. You want to, you know, and he's on board 100%. And for the first time, really, um, Terry starts to enjoy making pictures, and he also starts to benefit from prestige. Suddenly, all these people want to work with him, and that wasn't the case. When he cast Richard Gere in Days of Heaven, not only didn't he want him, he wanted John Travolta.
Right.
John Travolta he couldn't get because he had to fulfill a TV contract, and Richard Gere wouldn't cut his hair. So it wasn't even like, Richard Gere wasn't turning up and going like, "I'll do anything for the job." He was like, "I'm not cutting my hair for you." Um,
On Manz.
so that's what he has disco hair for the whole of the
Yeah.
film. Yeah, he's got Harrison Ford like Han
Very
Solo
70s.
locks.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, he's got 70s hair in the middle of the Depression.
Right.
Um, so he doesn't have that sort of power of like you're fired or do as I say or else. He just has to cajole a film out of them. He gets to, Thin Red Line and he has George Clooney coming in to do a very small part that, he
Yeah.
has
Right at
he
the
has
end.
people lining up. Yeah, and right at the end and sort of like he only sort of he really wanted to cut him out by the
Yeah.
end of the edit. It was he was undecided, but in the end, he left it too late to cut him out. Um, so yeah, Adrien Brody, be thank you, lucky stars. But I mean, that Adrien Brody thing, just as a side note, was a non-controversy. You
Right.
know, the script is online. Read the script. Adrien Brody doesn't have that many lines. The idea that he was the star of the movie is a fundamental misconception of
Yeah,
that
that's what I
movie.
always thought. I was glad you cleared that up because that was the story I always knew.
Yeah, I mean, I've read the novel.
Right.
I've read several iterations of the script, and in none of them is Adrian Brody's character uh, particularly sizable. I mean, maybe bigger than that. And the other thing is, film isn't about lines, it's a visual medium.
Mm.
So Adrian Brody is kind of always there in
Oh,
that
he's
film.
there a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, and he's a big set of eyes. And
Yeah.
I think Terry's much more interested in seeing your face than he is in necessarily hearing your voice.
Right.
Hence, he often cuts people's lines. Days of Heaven is, you hear Linda Manz a lot, and you hear Richard Gere and Brooke Adams hardly ever.
Right.
But when you get, uh, I mean, I was going to make a point about Adrian Brody's he's one of the colors that he wants to use to paint that picture,
Yeah.
and I think that comes through in the movie. I think it remains in the movie, but it's got nothing to do with how many lines he has or if there's there aren't conventional scenes in that film.
Right. No.
There are more than in his later films. Oh yeah, this is what I was going to say. I was talking to one of the editors of Tree of Life, and he told me that hell of a lot of that film is made of offcuts of like ends of takes and or half. So basically, they would have a scene with dialogue, and one of the kids would say something to Brad Pitt, and Brad Pitt would, he'd say, "I hate you, Dad, I hate you," and would run off, and Brad Pitt would sort of look at him
Yeah.
go, and he would just use the look and not use the line that had gone on before it. And he would do that with lots of, so he, as soon as he's in the editing suite, and I totally understand that for an actor that's infuriating,
Yeah.
because that look was not a response to
What happened?
whatever you,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly, yeah, it's, you've not built being built out of what you think you're doing. It's just something else. But I mean, ultimately, for me, it doesn't really matter because I'm not acting in the film, so I don't care. I want to see the end product. But I was told I'm working. Well, I've finished another book about Jonathan Glazer, and I was talking to someone who was closely involved with Birth, and that was a very troubled production in many ways. Partly because the script was in all sorts of shape as they were filming it. Um, and I heard from someone close to the production who said, there's so much in that movie that is actually cuts from after the director said cut. So the director said cut, print it, we'll go on to the next setup, and the camera is still rolling, and they've got an expression or somebody moving or something, and they've used that in the finished film.
I
And
see.
I find that fascinating because I watch Birth and I think it's this beautifully constructed, rational gem. But in reality, there are bits of it at least which are just like, how do we get from A to B? We haven't got anything from to get us from this part to this part. Well, okay, just put that in, that'll work, little sticky tape, and off we go.
I mean, his life is so fascinating to me. The way his career started and where it went, and I like that like it's well known that once he does To the Wonder and Forward, Song to Song, Knight of Cups, like these films, the critics just tore apart. And I like that you sort of answer not directly the detractors, maybe a couple, but you shared your takes on why you think these are really good movies. And now I couldn't help but wonder, because like I said, I found the book, even though it's a biography, also to be a great companion piece to watching the films and gaining a deeper appreciation. Did that I'm always interested in when people write, what's organic and what was thought of first before you started to um, put it on the page. Like, did that happen organically, or was that something you thought of before that I'm gonna have a defense, so to speak, of some of these movies here in this later period?
Um, no, no, actually, no. On the contrary, I wrote it very much as I would a novel, in that I started at the beginning and I went on. And I mean, easier than a novel because I knew where I was going. I knew that I had to cover a certain amount of ground. But I always wanted to know what had happened before I went on to the next part. I always wanted to have the chapter about his family done before I went on to talk about his school and his education and then his work and then his first film and so on and so forth. So I was going through the films chronologically with the same intensity. That's why I think, the way you've responded to it using it as a companion is kind of built into the book a little bit, that
Yeah,
you can do that because I'm learning about it alongside you. I'm going, okay, this is how this is working. And there is a development. There is a sense that to some degree the first two films are as bold as they are, they're kind of still quite conventional in
yeah,
some ways,
right.
and maybe the first three films. And then when you get to New World, you get a real, okay, we're going to push this experimentally, we're going to push a
Yes,
lot, and you start getting multiple versions of a film as well, and sort of like a sense that, and I love all of the versions actually. I think maybe the theatrical version might be my favorite because it's just a certain density, conciseness and density to it,
this is
which I really like.
the new world you're referring
Yeah, yeah.
to.
There's like the very first version, which is the theatrical version. Then there's a sort of a European version, which is a bit longer,
Yeah.
and then there's a director's cut, which is significantly longer.
Right.
Um, and I kind of like the wide release version, which I
Mm,
think is in some ways you could say is the one that they had to take stuff out to please the studio and to decrease the running time. But I kind of like that fact that he's working with a major studio and he's making it a, a thing.
mm,
And when I got to the later films, I did have a sense that oh, here I go. Because they weren't films that I loved to begin with. Okay. They were, yeah, I loved everything up to Tree of Life,
right.
which I really, really loved. Uh, Already at New World, I remember leaving the cinema aware that certain muscles had been used to like the film, that I would, slightly strained myself slightly to in order to like the film. And then to the wonder, I remember sitting down to that and sitting with somebody, and it was premiering in Venice, so I was sitting there next to a film critic, and they said, by the way, a lot of these critics who are the detractors, I know them personally. They're people who are friends of mine, and there are people, Stefania Zacharek, who writes for Time magazine. She came up with one of the most damning criticism lines, zingers, which is, Malick has never met a tree he didn't love. Um,
God.
and it's just yeah, yeah, but it's fundamentally he's right. You're absolutely right. He does love trees. There's no
That's
way
of
that's
nature.
yeah, exactly. And I can see both sides. I can see why people
Yeah.
don't get it and why they don't. But my job in the book was just to say, here's why it's going in this direction. You
Right.
don't have to like it,
Right.
but it's not like accidental, or it's not like he's suddenly lost it. There are legitimate criticisms to be made, and you could argue, okay, maybe he gets a bit starry-eyed with all the possible cast he has, and he should think, I just need some unknown people rather than Ben Affleck. But then I think he uses Ben Affleck in a really interesting way by not using him as a Hollywood star, but
Yeah. I
using
agree.
him as this sort of drudgy character who seems to be
Yes.
emotionally constipated.
Yes.
So
Yes.
it's it work, but that sort of working against people's expectations. People don't tend to like their
Mm,
expectations being worked against. So you go and see that film thinking I'm going to see a Ben Affleck film, and you're going to walk out disappointed. Um, I think To the Wonder should be looked at as I mean, that's the film that I think has the biggest biographical content
right.
alongside um, To the Wonder, because it's essentially about his second marriage, and there is stuff in there which, if you take Ben Affleck's character to be Terrence Malick, it's incredibly self-critical. It's incredible. He comes across as a cold,
Yeah.
uncaring, unfaithful man who
Yeah.
uncommunicative.
Inability to.
Uh, Absolutely, inability to love, inability to be spontaneous. He's and there's something else which is contained in the film, but the film is almost like too discreet to sort of show you, which is Olga Kurylenko's character at the end of the film. Spoiler, but not spoiler, because it's not explicit in the film, but she dies at the end of that film.
Right.
And you have to watch the film very closely
Yeah.
to understand that that is actually what happens in the story. And you could easily watch the film and say, no, no, she doesn't die, and you'd be justified in doing it because it's not as overt
Right.
as to be inarguable. But
Right.
I don't. I think that was entirely the intention, and that was entirely the idea. And indeed, Terrence Malick's second wife did die prematurely. Um, I think that he probably thought after doing Tree of Life, which was about grief, that doing another film about grief would be, and another film quite so personal would be uh, difficult. But I mean, the other thing is that he'd shot To the Wonder entirely by the time he premiered Tree of Life. So he finished picking up his the Palme d'Or in Paris, in Cannes, and he went back to the States um, and started editing uh, To the Wonder. Um, and 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 so people were like, "Oh, it's been really quick," but they were forgetting that Tree of Life had been really slow.
Right.
So it's kind of actually Tree of Life hadn't been as slow as everybody said, and To the Wonder wasn't as quick as everybody thought. It
Hmm.
was sort of like they both overlapped in a way that was, and that would happen quite a few times that he did Song to Song and Knight of Cups back to back. And so that's why, and the reason he did that was because he wanted to have the same cast in both films.
Right.
And it was also sort of a cheap, it's cheaper. You get them all there, you get them all scheduled, you use the camera crew. You don't have to bring them back and get them together for a second film. You can do it all, they do it with Harry Potter, they do it with Lord of the Rings, they can do it with us. And then that didn't quite work out because Christian Bale ultimately was replaced by Michael Fassbender for Song to Song.
Hmm.
Uh, but that sort of explains the experiment. And during that period, when he's making those three films, he's really got this idea that he's not making films to make great films per se as an end product. What he's doing is he's going through a series of experiments and asking questions and seeing how far he can push narrative cinema.
Right.
Uh, and the films are the end product of those arguments and discussions.
Mhm.
And and he will say his argument would be, it's amazing how little narrative cinema has changed.
Right.
That it's ultimately very, very similar to how it was in the 1940s and the 1930s. There's occasional things that a film will pop up, but it's essentially made of scenes, montage, action sequence. But these scenes are constructed together as a film in a very monotonous way if you want to look at the whole stretch of cinema. And the only thing that is different is the content, who the characters are,
Yeah.
where the place is set, generic tropes and whatnot. But actually how the story is told.
Yeah.
Can I tell a film, since the silent era to now, once we have sound introduced, it sort of becomes ossified.
Yeah.
And his goal is, let's see if I can change that. And I don't think the thing about him not having a script was actually true. I think what he didn't have was scenes. I think what he had this idea that I want to make films in which you're not watching a scene with a beginning, middle, and an end, and you're just flowing through the film. You're just moving with the film.
Mm.
And I talked to Bilger Beery about To the Wonder, and he was like, that film makes sense if you see it as a dance movie. And so if you're watching it and you're going, oh God, why is she dancing all the time? It's like watching Gene Kelly in American in Paris and say, why is he always dancing all the time? Because it's a musical, because that's what it's about. That's what her dancing is part of the movie. It's not a bug, it's a feature. It's not something, nobody would do that in real life. And guess what? It's not real life. It's not a
Right.
realistic movie, you
Right.
know? Um, so that kind of decision, yeah, it's estranging. It's pushing you away a little bit. If you're used to just watching everything that
Yeah. Exactly.
Hollywood produces,
Yeah.
you know, and that's why it fits much more into world cinema and more experimental stuff. And I tell you the truth, I think its effect has been unacknowledged because I think if you look at Paul Thomas Anderson and you look at Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer, you
Mm.
watch Oppenheimer, and here's the question: could Oppenheimer have been made if Tree of Life hadn't been made?
Right.
And I think it wouldn't be. I honestly think that idea of, I mean, there are very few scenes in Oppenheimer.
Right.
People are always moving. People are always moving. They're always going forward. There's this progression. There are lines. There are things, but there are very few scenes which are longer than 4 or 5 lines.
Right.
It's and it's cutting in between black and white. It's got loads of things going on. I don't honestly think that
Good
he
point.
gets there without Malick really pushing the envelope. And I think there's a lot of filmmakers watched To the Wonder, Night of Cups. Less people watch Song to Song, I'll admit, but they watched those films and they went, "Wow, that's interesting." Not necessarily, experiments fail. Experiments fail. 90% of experiments fail. That's why they're experiments. So they might not accomplish exactly what they seek to do, but they're really interesting in how they establish those possibilities. And
Yeah.
and that I just want to be sorry, I want to be really clear.
No, no, go ahead.
I don't think To the Wonder fails. I think To the Wonder is perhaps one of the films that has gained in my estimation through the writing of the book. I think Night of Cups has moments of absolute ecstasy and transformation. I think Song to Song is a little bit of a mess, but is is still an incredibly rich film and is still doing a lot of stuff. And I again, Voyage of Time has grown from a 1 star review to a 4 to 5 star review for me.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I like what you said. It's like poetry. You're not gonna get a poem right away. You've got to read it a few times. And his films, particularly this later period, you can't just watch them once. You have to return to them. And I saw To the Wonder when it came out because I love The Tree of Life. And then I saw To the Wonder and I hated it. And then I watched it again. Again, your book was a big help and I liked it a lot more. I wasn't crazy about Song to Song, even though, like, I agree with you, it has amazing moments. But I love Knight of Cups. I thought Knight of Cups. I'm like, how can people love someone like Antonioni or like La Cliché and not love Knight of Cups? I just don't get it. That Knight of Cups to me is a brilliant film. And I went on YouTube just to see other reviews and um I couldn't. There was one person I found who really liked it, but mostly even going on looking at podcasts and stuff. I was like, man, this film just got torn to bits, and it's a shame because I thought, wow, I mean that movie I thought was incredible. So hopefully that I may review it actually because now that it's 10 years on, hopefully people its reputation will rise. And of course, A Hidden Life, like I love The Hidden Life. It's much more conventional and easier to watch, but also you really see his hallmarks are certainly there with the spiritual questions and again, seeing something grim yet in a beautiful way on the flip side. It's very is it Malachian, I guess. Yeah, I love that. Yeah. Yeah, that
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, I think we need to establish that. We have Fellini-esque, Hitchcockian, Lynchian. We need a Malachian is where we need to go.
Absolutely. No, I'm up for that. And I agree with you with Knight of Cups. I think Knight of Cups has all those things. Antonioni, you mentioned, the tennis ball in the swimming pool with the dog
Yeah.
sort of chasing it. I think there's elements of humor that get missed a lot of the time. I don't want to be like the stereotypical English teacher laughing at the Shakespeare play to show how clever he is, but there are genuine moments of like, this is just a bit silly, him
Oh, for sure.
crawling around on the floor and um I mean, it's a strange movie because it's like all about drugs and drink and stuff, and nobody ever seems to take anything. There's no actual, you actually don't see people consuming stuff. You just see the effect of it. Um, I think that film is really interesting because I think it records a part of his life, which was when he was a screenwriter in the 70s, and he was in between Badlands and well, it was sort of even before Badlands. He was in the AFI, and he was writing scripts for films that never got made, and he was writing scripts for films. He was a really successful screenwriter. He wrote, you know, Deadhead Miles. He wrote a film for Stacy Keach that got made, called The Dion Brothers, or The Gravy Train is another title for it. He wrote Pocket Money, which was the director of Cool Hand Luke with Paul Newman and Lee Marvin.
Yeah, I quite enjoy
These
that
are sort
actually.
yeah, they're none of them. Well, maybe Gravy Train is probably the most accomplished of them. It's it's been championed by Tarantino among others, but none of them were sort of like he didn't quite get that hit, which in a way is sort of a good thing because it meant that he was just paying the rent. He was getting
Right.
paid more for that script writing than he ever did for being a director, for instance.
Mm,
And when he was in Paris, he wrote a version of Great Balls of Fire, which was made eventually with Winona Ryder and Dennis Quaid.
right, right.
And his version of the script was too dark because it told the story of Jerry Lee Lewis, who married a 14-year-old cousin and, shot people occasionally and was nicknamed Killer. He's
Yeah.
nicknamed Killer. Yeah, and he was on that. And he's was related to Jimmy Swaggart as well. And he wanted to tell that story as like a combination story. I mean, he would get paid loads of money for that sort of work, and that's how he continued living in Paris or between Paris and Texas, and not necessarily having to make a film himself. I mean, I remember talking to a director once who said, every time I make a film, I'm taking a huge pay cut because
Mm,
it means I can't make adverts for three
right,
months, and
right.
adverts pay the rent, and
Yeah.
making a film often doesn't. It often means taking a deferred salary, which might arrive, might never arrive.
Mhm.
Um, so Knight of Cups was really, I think, was is a very personal film for him. I love Brian Dennehy in that film.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
I, I love and I love that sense as well that that's a really surreal film. You
Yes.
have them sort of acting things out on rooftops,
Yeah.
and there's absolutely no, why are
Right.
they
Where are the
throwing
mirror?
furniture?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. What are they doing? And what's this? And I talked to Frida Pinto, who is plays one of the women. I mean, it got knocked a bit for being like all the women are just reflections of the male fantasy or the male desire, sort of a feminist critique, which is it's kind of it deserves to be aired, and it's certainly valid. Um, there's an element where I think, well, it's kind of almost like that's because it's a 70s sensibility that is coming through, that he's basically this um a little bit like the drugs as well, though. It's sort of this Lothario who you don't see in that many. I mean, you see him in a sort of threesome at the very beginning. He's sort of
Yeah.
jumping around in underwear.
Yeah.
But I
That's
mean,
his escape, I guess, with his escape from his existential problems were to go and sleep around. And those are the only time you see him like happy at all is like
yeah,
it's like drinking for him or drug taking. That's how I took it, anyways.
absolutely. And that also that scene is Blow Up. It's the scene with the models
Yes,
and David
yes.
Hemming in Blow Up as So I see a lot of different influences there. Zabriskie Point. He keeps going to the desert. It's
Yes, yes, that's right.
And Malick would do that. Malick would go to the desert to write. He would go out to, he had a particular motel that he would go to, and he would sit in the motel and he would turn the AC on and he would write. So to this day, he'll, hire a hotel room and go to write. I mean, that's sort of my hope with the idea that he's done this in the past, that maybe with Way of the Wind, he's already sort of shot another project that we don't know about. So we're actually going to get Way of the Wind and then straight away something afterwards, which will be like, whoa, we got two films now.
Hope so. I hope so. Well, again, I, I I can't recommend it enough. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. It's called The Magic Hours: The Films and Hidden Life of Terrence Malick. If for people who want to get the book, where do you suggest they go?
You can get it from, well, Matt Zoller sites. if he's got any copies left, has some signed copies, and it's always good to promote and support independent bookstores wherever you can.
Right.
So if you can do that, you can get it direct from the publisher, University of Kentucky Press. And yeah, it's available in Amazon, Barnes and Noble, wherever there are good bookstores or good internet sites that internet sites. Yeah, you can get it. And there is going to be a sort of mass market paperback coming out in about a year.
Oh, great.
And also there's going to be a French translation in November and a an Audible
Oh, wow.
book. So
Fantastic.
it's yeah, it's spreading out, which is really so heartening
Yeah,
after all this time.
that's great. Fantastic. And if people want to follow you on social media or go to your website, where's the best place for them to go?
I'm on Blue Sky, johnbleasdale.com. I'm on Instagram at Dr. Jonty, DRJONTY. Yeah, I think those are the only two places I deleted my Twitter account. My
Guy.
substantial Twitter account
Oh,
was
God.
like 40,000 followers, like
Oh, wow.
that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, it was
I'd
that
not,
was that
but I applaud the choice.
yeah, well, it had to be done.
Yeah.
Who knew that I would cross the line at Nazi salutes? Who knew that that would be that would be the line that this
Yes.
far and no further, I said.
Right. Right. No, I don't blame you. And when is the Jonathan Glazer book is due out soon, I believe, right?
Very soon. It's going to coming out in a month.
Oh, okay.
And it's going to be August the 1st. So actually less than a month. We're talking July the 2nd now. Yeah, August 1st is the planned publication date. It might be pushed a little bit, but might even be anticipated. That's coming out by a New York press called Sticking Place
Oh,
Books,
it's taking place. Yes, of course.
uh, which is looks really good. I'm really pleased with the book, and I'm really excited to see what people think about it. It's
Yeah.
not a biography, and it's quite different to Magic Hours in the sense that primarily it's not a biography, but also I've not I've interviewed far fewer people for this book, and it's much more like a critical examination of what his cinema means. But it's also kind of quite pop in a way. It's hopefully written in an entertaining, you know, easy to read fashion. That I for me, an anathema is I don't want to bore people. That's the most important thing for me more than anything else. And so um, it with Glazer, it's not difficult because he's dealing with ideas that are really interesting, really fascinating. So I just ran with the ideas that the material was providing me with.
Mm.
For films, but I also go into his music videos and I go into his commercial work, which people might know less of or not. I'm not sure. Um, he made some extremely influential adverts. The Guinness adverts, the Surfer, for instance, was a huge prize winner at the time. And yeah, it's really good. And it's really interesting because in Bologna, he was doing a talk for In Conversation, a series of conversations that were held with different filmmakers. Jim Jarmusch was there,
Oh, great.
Terry Gilliam,
Oh, wow.
um, and he did one. And I had the friend was actually hosting the talk, sent me a ticket for the front row, and sort of said, just try to collar him because I'd not talked to him for the book. I found him just as difficult as Terrence Malick to talk to. And so so when the talk closed, I had to sort of bum rush the stage, or at least backstage, and sort of get past the security and everything and introduce myself. And I kind of had assumed he knew about the book and he didn't want to know, because I obviously reached out to his people and all that. I assumed he knew about it and he just said, I don't want to have anything to do with this. don't talk to this guy. The opposite of Terrence Malick.
Right.
And in fact, from his reaction, I think that wasn't the case. That was just me being paranoid. And he was seemed to be actually quite pleased with the idea. So I
Oh,
got an
great.
address to send the book, and it
Oh,
turned
fantastic.
out, yeah, it turned out really good. And hopefully that will see how the book is received. But if it's received well, it would be good to do a second edition and maybe get an interview,
Yeah.
and have a think
Yeah.
about it that way.
Yeah, no, I hope so.
What do you think of Jonathan Glazer?
I was just gonna say I've only seen Under the Skin. I haven't seen his other films, and I loved Under the Skin, but I have not seen his other three. So this is the beauty of interviewing people like you. Part of it's like, oh, I'll read a book on Malick, and it gives me the opportunity to explore the filmmaker and turn it into an episode. So I'll have to have,
I hear you.
yeah, I'll have to have you
I,
back with a Glazer book.
I will send you a copy immediately. I'm that's really good because that means I can accompany you once more
Yes,
through
yes.
through the through the process of discovering this filmmaker. No, he's a wonderful filmmaker. I think he's one of these people who manages the strange trick of being consistent in very different genres.
Mm,
So he makes a crime movie, he makes a sort of semi-supernatural ghosty type movie in terms of Sexy Beast and Birth, and then you've seen Under the Skin, so you know it's a sort of very non-conventional science fiction movie. And then Zone of Interest, of course, is a
yeah,
historical period drama, which is, and if you want to call it, it's a bit, I find it a bit disturbing to call something a Holocaust movie as if that's a genre, but
right.
alas it is. Yeah, so he makes very different movies, but at the same time there is a coherence to that being one person's vision. So
Mm.
yeah, it'll be interesting. I can't wait to hear your point of view.
Yeah, no, I look forward to it. And for all of John's social media handles and his website, all of that information will be in the description box below. So, John, thank you again. This was a great pleasure to have you on, and I look forward to having you back sometime down the road.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Robert. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
You as well, and thank you all so much for watching. I want to thank all of my members on Patreon. If you're interested in becoming a member of my Patreon, head over to the link, patreon.com/Robert Bellissimo at the movies for full details. You can also leave a donation or what I call a tip by clicking the thanks link, which you will find directly below the video frame. Just click on that and you can leave a donation if you choose to. Of course, I would greatly appreciate that. And lastly, if this is your first time here, please consider subscribing. It is absolutely free to do so. By pressing the Robert Bellissimo at the movie logo, you will see it floating above my head in the top left corner to your top left. In just a second, just click on that. And then click the bell in order to get a notification every time I release one of my new videos. I would also really appreciate if you leave a comment, share the video, like the video. All of these things create traction onto my YouTube channel and really help share the video far and wide and the channel in general. So thank you so much for doing that, and I will see you all in the next one.